bean casserole was bubbling at the edges, right on cue. I'd learned years ago that my mother-in-law liked it served the moment the cheese started to brown. Not before, not after. Too early, and she'd call it underdeveloped. Too late, and she'd press her lips together in that particular way that meant she'd be talking about it to my husband for the next 2 weeks. So I watched it. I stood at that oven like a hawk, dish towel folded over my shoulder. Timer already set even though I knew I wouldn't need it. That was the kind of wife I'd become. The kind who memorized oven preferences. The kind who started prepping the night before because there wasn't enough counter space to do it all the morning of. The kind who drove 40 minutes to a specific grocery store in Naperville because they carried the brand of French fried onions my father-in-law preferred, and the regular ones from Jewel just didn't taste right to him. 12 years. I'd been doing this for 12 years. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next, because I think it matters. I was not a doormat. I was not a woman who didn't know her own worth. I had spent 11 years as a project manager at a mid-sized architecture firm in Chicago, working my way up from coordinator to director of operations. I managed multi-million-dollar builds. I led teams of 20. I had sat across from city officials and general contractors and partners who wore their condescension like cologne, and I had walked every single one of them back to the table on my terms. I knew who I was. I just also happened to love my husband, and I genuinely thought that when he asked me to move from Chicago to his hometown of Decatur 3 years ago so he could take over his father's hardware business, that it was a partnership, a temporary sacrifice with a shared plan attached. We talked about it. He'd said 6 months to stabilize the business. Then we'd look at options. Maybe I'd find something in Springfield. Maybe we'd move back. 6 months became a year. A year became 3. I'd taken remote consulting work, a fraction of what I used to earn, because that was what was available, and because someone had to keep our health insurance while my husband figured out what he wanted the hardware store to be. But that's not what this story is about. This story is about the last Thursday of November. It is about the 12-pound turkey I dry-brined for 2 days. It is about the scratch-made cranberry relish with orange zest. Not the canned kind, never the canned kind, because my sister-in-law had mentioned once 3 years ago that canned cranberry was lazy, and it had apparently lodged itself permanently in my brain. It is about the mashed potatoes I'd started at 9 in the morning because my mother-in-law needed them smooth enough to pass through a fine mesh strainer, and that takes time. 11 people. My husband's parents, his sister and her husband, their 3 kids, his aunt and uncle from Bloomington, and his cousin who had driven up from St. Louis. 11 people sitting at my table in my house eating food I had spent 3 days preparing. My husband had spent the morning watching college football. I want to be precise about that too. Not because I'm bitter, or maybe I am, a little, now, but because precision is what I'm good at. He watched football from 9 until kickoff at noon, then the second game, then he drifted into the kitchen at some point around 2 to ask if I needed help, and I'd said what I always said, which was, "I've got it," and he'd nodded and drifted back out. I'd had it. Everyone arrived at 4. My mother-in-law came in, looked around the kitchen, and said the sweet potatoes smelled interesting. My father-in-law immediately relocated to the living room. My sister-in-law handed me her coat without looking at me and asked if there was white wine. The kids scattered. The aunt and uncle from Bloomington were perfectly pleasant, actually, the only ones who offered to help, and I put them in charge of filling water glasses because it was the one task I could hand off without worrying it would derail something. We sat down at 6. The food was, by every objective measure, good. The turkey was perfect. I knew it was perfect before I even carved it, because I had a meat thermometer and I knew how to use it. The gravy was smooth. The green bean casserole was browned exactly right. There was a small dish of the cranberry relish, and a store-bought version I'd set out because the kids wouldn't eat mine, and a basket of Parker House rolls I'd made from a recipe I'd bookmarked 18 months ago, and finally tried for the first time that morning. My sister-in-law said the rolls were store-bought, right? And I said, no, I made them, and she said, huh, and reached for her wine. We were midway through dinner. My father-in-law was talking about the hardware store. My mother-in-law was talking about the hardware store. My mother-in-law was talking about a neighbor's renovation. The kids had abandoned their plates and were somewhere in the back of the house. The aunt and uncle from Bloomington were the only ones who'd said anything kind about the food. twice, and I had held on to both comments like lifelines. My husband cleared his throat. I remember looking up because there was something in that sound, something rehearsed. "I've been thinking," he said, "and I think we should talk about separating." The table went very quiet, not surprised quiet. That's the part I keep coming back to, even now, months later. Not one person at that table looked surprised. My mother-in-law reached for her water glass. My sister-in-law looked at her plate. My father-in-law leaned back in his chair. They knew. "I think we've grown in different directions," my husband continued. He was using the tone he used in business meetings. Measured. Pre-packaged. "And I think it's better to be honest now than to wait." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at my mother-in-law. She was watching me with an expression I can only describe as cautiously expectant, the way you watch someone open a gift you're not sure they'll like. I set my fork down, very gently, the way you set down something you don't want to break. "Okay," I said. I stood up. I picked up my plate, my glass, my napkin. I walked to the kitchen and set them by the sink. I took my coat from the hook by the back door. I picked up my purse, which I'd left on the bench in the mudroom, and I checked without even thinking about it, a reflex. My wallet was in there, my phone, my keys, the external hard drive I'd started keeping with me 3 weeks ago after a conversation I'll tell you about in a minute. I went back to the dining room doorway. Everyone was still sitting exactly where I'd left them. "The leftover turkey should rest another 20 minutes before you slice it," I said. "The cranberry relish is better tomorrow. Good night." I walked out the front door. Let me back up 3 weeks, because this is the part that matters. My best friend, she and I have been close since college. We were in the same dormitory freshman year at the University of Illinois, and we've never really stopped talking since. She'd called me on a Tuesday night in early November. I was making dinner alone because my husband was at the store late, which had become a frequent enough occurrence that I'd stopped leaving food warm for him. She asked how I was doing. I said fine. She was quiet for a second, which with her means she doesn't believe you. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to just sit with it for a second before you answer." I said, "Okay. When's the last time you felt like things were actually going well, in the marriage?" I sat with it, like she asked. I couldn't find an answer. Not because things had been terrible. They hadn't been. Not in any dramatic, obvious way. But I realized, sitting there at my own kitchen counter, that I'd been describing my marriage in terms of absence rather than presence for a long time. It wasn't bad. There wasn't fighting. There weren't scenes. There was just nothing much. And I'd been so busy filling the nothing with casseroles and county store drives and remote consulting work and keeping things running that I hadn't stopped to look at it directly. I said, "I think I need to talk to someone." She said yes. She also said something else, and I want to be careful about how I say this because I don't want it to sound like she was being paranoid, because she wasn't. She'd been through her own divorce 4 years ago, and she said gently, "Before anything, and I mean before anything, I want you to know where everything is. Your accounts, your documents, all of it. Just know." I said I did know. She said, "Do you know what's in the joint account right now?" I logged in while we were still on the phone. I don't want to give an exact number because it's not the point, but I'll tell you this. It was significantly less than it should have been. We had a joint checking account that we both deposited into, and a joint savings account that we'd both been contributing to for years. The savings account had a balance that was, in round numbers, about 60% of what it had been the last time I'd looked, which had been several months ago. I asked my husband about it the next day. He said he'd moved some funds around for the business, and that he'd explain it later. He never explained it later. I went and saw a family law attorney in Springfield 2 weeks after that phone call. Not because I'd decided anything, just because I wanted to understand what I was looking at. She was calm and thorough, and she explained things to me without condescension, which I appreciated more than I said. She told me about marital assets and how Illinois courts treat them. She told me to document everything I could. She told me to open a personal account in my name only and to start keeping records. I opened the account the next day, a checking and the savings at a credit union across town from where my husband banked. I set up direct deposit for my consulting income. I found every financial document in the house: tax returns, investment statements, the business records I'd had access to because I'd been doing the bookkeeping for the hardware store for 2 years without being compensated for it, which my attorney found very interesting, and I made copies, digital and physical, the external hard drive. I was not planning for divorce. I was planning because I am a project manager. I plan. That's what I do. And then Thanksgiving happened. I drove to my best friend's apartment in Champaign that night. It's about 45 minutes from Decatur. She opened the door before I'd finished knocking, which means she'd been watching from my headlights, and she handed me a glass of wine and didn't say anything for a while, which is one of the reasons I love her. I was not crying. I was not hysterical. I was, honestly, a little stunned, not by the fact of it, not any more, but by the public nature of it, by the choreography of it, by the fact that he'd looked at that dining room table, with my turkey and my from-scratch rolls and my orange-zest cranberry relish, with his family sitting there eating food I'd spent 3 days on, and thought, yes, this is the moment. This is where I do this. The whole family knew, I said. She nodded. She'd suspected as much, she said. We talked for a long time. I called my attorney's after-hours line and left a message. I called my mom, who lives outside of Indianapolis, and I told her I was okay before she could ask, because she would ask. She offered to drive to Champaign. I said not yet. I didn't call my husband back that night. He called twice while I was driving, once more at 11. I let them all go to voicemail. The next morning, my attorney called before 9. She was, I think, less surprised than I'd expected her to be. She told me she wanted to move forward quickly on a few things, including a motion related to the business records, specifically the question of whether funds had been moved from marital assets without my consent, which, given what I'd seen in that savings account, was a reasonable question to raise. She said the bookkeeping I'd done for the store, unpaid for 2 years, was also something the court would likely consider when dividing assets. She used the phrase dissipation of marital assets, and I wrote it down. My husband called 6 more times that day. His mother called twice. His sister called once, left a voicemail I've listened to so many times I could recite it, in which she sounds careful and measured and not at all like someone who watched her brother announce the end of my marriage over turkey and said nothing. I called back 3 days later. My husband's call specifically. His mother and sister I let go. The conversation was not what he expected. I think he'd expected tears. I think he'd expected negotiation, or maybe the opposite, anger he could point to, a reaction he could use to frame the narrative in a particular way. He got neither. I told him I had retained an attorney. I told him that I had been advised not to discuss the specifics of our financial situation until we were formally in the process. I told him that I had found alternate housing, my friend's apartment for the short term, a furnished month-to-month in Springfield I'd found that morning for the medium term, and that I would be coordinating the retrieval of my belongings with a time that worked for both of us. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't think he started. I know, I said. The calls from his family escalated after that. His mother called 4 times in one day. His sister sent a long text that was, in summary, about how my behavior was making things difficult for everyone. His father called once, which shocked me. His father had never called me directly in 12 years of marriage, not once, and left a voicemail that was short and uncomfortable and seemed to be about whether I'd reconsider. I didn't call any of them back. Here is what they hadn't accounted for. Here is the thing about assuming someone is so absorbed in keeping everything running that they haven't been paying attention. I had been paying attention. I knew the hardware store's finances because I'd been doing the books. I knew what the receivables looked like, and I knew what the note on the building looked like. And I knew that 2 of the store's largest commercial accounts were relationships I personally helped maintain, because those account managers had started their careers in construction, and they liked talking to someone who could speak the language. My husband was good at retail. He was not particularly good at the commercial side. I also knew that my name was still on 3 of those commercial contracts as the secondary contact, a detail from the early days, when we'd been building the business together, that had never been updated. My attorney made note of that, too. The divorce took 8 months from filing to finalization. Illinois requires a 6-month waiting period after separation for uncontested divorces, and ours was not entirely uncontested in the beginning, though it became closer to that as things progressed, and my husband's attorney, I think, helped him understand what the realistic landscape looked like. I'm not going to walk through all of it, but I will tell you the parts that mattered. The marital assets were divided, and the court did consider the funds that had been moved from the joint savings, which my attorney argued, and the documentation supported, had been done without my knowledge or consent. The years of unpaid bookkeeping were factored in, the career I paused, the income differential between what I'd been earning and what I earned while supporting the move to Decatur, the cost of re-establishing myself professionally, all of it was part of the conversation. I also got the car. I'm almost embarrassed by how much that mattered to me, but it was the car I'd bought 3 months before the move to Decatur with my own money, and it was the one thing in all of it that felt like proof of something I could hold on to. I'm back in Chicago now. I took a position at a larger firm, commercial development focus, more than I was making before the move, better title than I had before the move. My best friend drove with me when I moved back, both of us in my car, and a rented cargo van with the things I'd kept, and when we crossed the county line out of Decatur, she turned the radio up and we drove the rest of the way with the windows down, even though it was January and 41 degrees. My mum cried when I called to tell her I'd made it. I told her I was okay, which this time was actually true. I don't know what my ex-husband's family thought was going to happen. I tried to understand the logic of it. The idea that announcing a divorce in front of 11 people on Thanksgiving, in my house, at my table, would produce a particular outcome. Maybe they thought I'd be too embarrassed to fight. Maybe they thought I'd feel outnumbered. Maybe they just didn't think about it at all, because no one in that family had ever really thought about what I would or wouldn't do. I'd been background, support staff, the one who handled the casserole. What I know is this. I'd been building something in Decatur for 3 years, something I'd agreed to build in partnership with someone who'd already decided, at some point I can't identify precisely, that the partnership was over. And when that became clear, I had 2 choices. I could be the person who got surprised, or I could be the person who'd already made her calls. I made my calls in November. The turkey was just the day they figured it out. There's something I go back to sometimes, a small thing, almost embarrassing in how small it is. Those Parker House rolls. I'd bookmarked the recipe 18 months ago. I'd been saving it for the right occasion. I'd finally made them that morning, got up early, mixed the dough, let it rise, shaped each one by hand, brushed them with butter, right out of the oven. My sister-in-law thought they were store-bought. The aunt from Bloomington asked for the recipe on her way out. She was the only one who called, later, to ask if I was doing okay. She sent a card in January that I still have somewhere in a box. The rolls were good. I've made them twice since then. Some day I'll host Thanksgiving again, when I have a kitchen and a table full of people who actually want to be there, and I'll make them again. I've got time. I've got the recipe. And this time, I get to choose who sits at my table. I've thought a lot about what made that Thanksgiving dinner the turning point, not just in my marriage, but in how I understand the way consequences actually work in real life. People talk about karma like it's something that arrives dramatically, like a storm you can see coming. In my experience, it doesn't work that way. It works slowly, quietly, almost bureaucratically. Every choice a person makes builds something or hollows something out. My husband made choices over years, small ones mostly, letting me drive 40 minutes for the right brand of fried onions without once offering to go himself, moving money from a joint account without a conversation, choosing the Thanksgiving table, my food, my 3 days of work, as the stage for an announcement he'd already rehearsed. Each of those choices built a version of reality that he thought he controlled. And he did for a while, until he didn't. What I keep coming back to is this. I didn't win because I got angry. I didn't win because I was louder, or because I had someone in my corner who was meaner. I won, if that's even the right word, because I had been paying attention when no one thought I was. That's the thing about being underestimated. It has a cost, but it also has a return. When you've been treated like background for long enough, people forget to account for you. They stop watching what we're doing. And if you're smart, and if you're honest with yourself about what you're actually looking at, that invisibility becomes a kind of preparation. My best friend asked me a question in November that I didn't have an answer to. That question cracked something open. Not dramatically. I didn't have a breakdown or a revelation. I just started seeing clearly, the way your eyes adjust when you step out of a dim room. I saw the savings account. I saw the pattern. I made a call to an attorney, and I made a few more calls, and I kept doing the next reasonable thing until I had built something solid underneath me before anyone else knew I was building. That's what I want to pass on, if this story is useful to anyone. Not the specifics of Illinois divorce law, not the particulars of marital asset division. Your situation is your own, and you should talk to someone who knows it. What I want to pass on is the idea that clarity is a form of strength, knowing what you're actually looking at, not what you hoped it was, not what it used to be. That is an act of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like opening a bank account. It looks like making copies of documents. It looks like driving 45 minutes to a friend's apartment on a Thursday night with your coat and your purse and your hard drive and very little else. I made Parker House rolls from scratch that morning. I'd been saving the recipe for 18 months. I shaped each one by hand. My sister-in-law thought they were store-bought. The aunt from Bloomington asked me for the recipe. I know which one I'm still in contact with. The life I'm building now is quieter than I expected, and better. I work more. I earn more. I choose who sits at my table. That last part sounds small. It is not small. It is, I think, the whole thing.